So after the rather cataclysmic shake-up of the Warzone Nephilim changes, which armies in 40k are the strongest right now? Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today I thought we'd do a bit of a tier ranking of the armies in 40k, now that a little of the dust is starting to settle on that massive great big Nephilim update, where they seem to have thrown in major changes for just about every single army, either major rules rewrites, buffs, nerfs, and a whole bunch of points changes too. Previously, some of the top armies in 40k have been in a bit of a rut, I thought. I think the last balanced data slate did do a good job of making a lot of armies a lot more balanced, but then they immediately released Tyranids, and it meant that they were basically topping all the tournaments, and seemed on another power level compared with the rest. Now though, Tyranids have been heavily reined in, as have a fair few of the other top factions, and most of the lower tier ones have got decent buffs as well. Overall, it's looking like new style 40k could be more interesting and balanced than it's been in a while, with a lot more armies having a decent chance to win. Just to recap, since the last tier list video that I made, an absolutely enormous amount of things have changed in 40k. The command point changes in Warzone Nephilim means that relics, detachments, and alpha strikes are a bit nerfed. Both the core rulebook and the faction-specific secondaries have been altered quite a bit. That has really big implications for some armies and how well they can score victory points. The points changes that they came out with in that free download were at least fairly wide-reaching and quite nicely actually tailored to the current meta rather than having to guess 6 months in advance. And for the most part, they do seem to have been pretty intelligently applied, a lot of the weaker factions being buffed and a lot of the top factions being reined in. The armies that were doing best seem to have got the lion's share of the nerfs. Then, to combo with that, there's a few rules changes. Certain army special rules, such as Luck of the Laughing God, Tyranids adaptive things, and Craftworlds Fire and Fade got nerfed. Necrons got better command protocols, and guard vehicles got Armour of Contempt. And then to cap it all off, we've got a new Chaos Codex thrown into the mix. This one has an awful lot of rules in it, particularly for all the different legions. My guess is that out of the bat it's not looking as insanely strong as Tyranids was, but there might well be some hidden potential and some very scary lists that aren't immediately obvious. Putting all of those things together, I would say that this list is my prediction for how things are going to be turning out. I'll certainly be looking forward to revisit the topic after we've had a fair few tournament results come out, and people have had chance to put theory into practice in earnest. I'm sure there'll be lots of people with their own alternate takes for their own armies. As always with these tier lists, if you think that I've ranked anything too high or too low, let me know down in the comments. In general though, my biggest prediction for this though is that 40k in general is going to be a lot more balanced after this. A lot more factions with a chance to win, and a lot fewer matchups where you're just going to think my army is completely outclassed, what's the point in playing? With that in mind, I've divided the armies into 3 major tiers, Tier 3 being the lowest and Tier 1 being the highest, which I think will compete well at tournaments, and then I've subdivided the top tier into an upper, mid and lower tier, armies that I all think are at least reasonably close in power level, but perhaps some stand out a bit more and some a bit less. Maybe I'm going to get criticism for putting quite so many armies in a similar tier to each other, but I do genuinely feel that after this update, a lot of armies are going to be at least reasonably similar on power, at least compared with the massive disparities that we've had before. With all that being said though, let's jump into it and talk through the armies of 40k, starting with the weakest and going to the strongest. So first up, we'll start with Tier 3, the weakest armies in 40k at the moment, and to be honest, I don't think I could justify putting anything else than just one army down here, and unfortunately for them, it's Chaos Demons. So at the moment I would pretty much rate Chaos Demons as the single weakest army in Warhammer 40k. Throughout 9th edition they started off kind of okay, even then though they've tended to rely on some fairly out there lists, things like Triple Keepers of Secrets and Bellicor being some of the common things. Weirdly, over the balance updates they seem to have had their good units repeatedly nerfed, without having their weaker units buffed by enough to actually make them so you'd want to take them. Admittedly, Triple Keeper of Secrets and Bellicor can certainly give people problems advancing into your deployment zone turn 1 for early charges, and demons can still be very strong in Chaos Soup lists, things like Epidemius supporting Death Guard demon engines, and Slaanesh Heralds allowing Slaanesh demon units to advance and charge. Still though, they certainly weren't doing particularly well beforehand, and then some of the weakest armies in the balance patch got some decent buffs, things like Guard with their Armour of Contempt on vehicles, and Chaos Marines getting their whole new codex. On top of that, it's probably going to be hard to field multiple detachments and multiple exalted greater demons due to the command point cost in Nephilim, meaning that even their strongest builds aren't looking quite as good as they were. Basically, demons I do feel are basically a rung below everyone else. I think they really need their new codex, and at least my guess would be that it will probably be the next one that Games Workshop eventually releases, purely because they didn't release any changes for them in terms of points or rules, and I think they would have otherwise if their book was still a long way off. Maybe it might get released at the same time as that new Demon Prince does, perhaps. In any case, moving on, here's Tier 2. All of these armies do have really decent strengths, but I would say that they're generally going to be solidly behind the rest of the pack. Here we've got Astra Militarum, Orks, Genestealer Cult, and the Adeptus Mechanicus. First up, let's talk Guard. Previously, I would have rated them to be equal or even below the Demons, but they got some really solid buffs from the new balanced data slates. Armour of Contempt on Leman Russes and vehicles in general is a massive boost to them, and it comes on the back of the Hammer of the Emperor being excellent for spamming mass last shots. Basically, big parts of their codex got an enormous damage and durability buff, and they've paired that with a fair few incidental points cuts here and there, such as free gear for infantry squads. Tank commanders with demolishers are looking really annoying to shift now and still do very decent damage. Hammer of the Emperor is going to be great with hotshot lasguns from Scions. The auto wounds thing is great for decent AP low strength things. Guard have the only artillery that don't take the barrage nerf, and particularly Cadian mortars can spam out a fair few wounds on things, and combine that all with some fairly expendable units and move on objective secure bodies. For all that though, I do think that Guard have a fair few weaknesses. They don't really do all that well in terms of melee threat, and if your opponent's got some fast movers that can touch things like Demolisher tank commanders, then locking them up can be really painful. Their stratagem and support options tend to be fairly underwhelming, and the Nephilim command point changes have certainly not helped the Cadian supplement with their White Shield conscripts, and lots of command points that you could dump into Alpha Strikes. Despite a whole ton of patches and small points adjustments, a lot of datasheets do still remain pretty bad, non-functional, or overcosted, but I definitely think that they became a lot more interesting in the interim until they get their codex. I'd guess that just about every list will be wanting to run a fair few tank commanders with the Armour of Contempt, and I feel like mass hotshot Scions are going to see some play. Next up we have the Orks, who again were certainly on the spectrum of armies that were struggling a bit before the balance update, and unlike some of the other armies, I really don't think that they received quite enough to put them in contention with the top players. Generally the Orks either want to build around their War or Speed War, both of them do have advantages, though I'd probably argue that the War for the melee Orks has kind of got stronger than the Speed War now that it gives you an extra strength and invulns all round. I feel like perhaps Goths might be one of the best ways to go with Orks from here. Previously on the slide I had said that buggy and plane shooting can be really quite efficient in freebooters, but for some reason Games Workshop seems to have nerfed that into the floor, in an Orc faction FAQ just casually making the freebooters trait reroll 1s and not +1 to hit. Really don't know why, it was one of the few things that Orcs could do kind of okay. I genuinely do wonder if it might have been made in error. In any case though, Orcs do still have a lot of weaknesses. Buggy and fast attack type lists might struggle for command points with their Outrider detachments. Big Orc infantry units still will suffer to morale and having expensive boys run away. Even with a couple of turns of invulns, I still think that boys are going to struggle against other armies just spamming mass attacks, and having AP -1 on a lot of things isn't great against Armour of Contempt. Otherwise, Squig Buggies are still not so great given the barrage changes, even though their points went down a bit, and a lot of datasheets are just a bit underwhelming. I kind of feel Orcs might go a bit more towards a whole bunch of transports and boy mobs jumping out of them. Maybe a fair few battle wagons and kill rigs might be the way to go. The infantry changes and things did seem helpful, though arguably not really targeted to any of the Orcs' strongest stuff, even if I think it is a great thing that boys got a bit better. Next up, we've got Genestealer Cults, pretty much the forgotten faction in all these balance updates. I think Games Workshop must just have gone for the idea that they're kind of middle of the field, doing okay for themselves, even if they're a bit of a challenging army to play, and just decided to leave well alone. They still certainly have a fair amount of power. They'll be doing better against the factions that were at the top that got nerfed, but worse against the ones that got big buffs. They often pack a punch from Deep Strike Reserve with things like Twisted Helix giving you +1 strength and attack. They've got really nice tricks with their proficient planning, such as first turn charge pure strain Genestealers, popping up right next to the enemy or automatic crossfire, and back up their hammer blow infantry units with powerful buffing or debuff characters. As well as that, having a whole bunch of units that can drop in really close to the enemy makes picking up secondaries pretty easy. Even when they don't win, at least they tend to score fairly well. I think their main issue is probably going to be that they were kind of mid-tier before. They take a fair bit of skill to play, as their units are quite fragile and break easily, and they didn't really get any help from Nephilim at all, whereas a lot of the other mid-tier to lower-tier armies did. I guess perhaps Brood Brothers look a little bit more attractive now, so I guess that's something. Still though, I think they're going to be a bit more of a struggle than some of the other factions to win with. Finally for Tier 2 we have the Adeptus Mechanicus, who did seem to be vying for one of the weaker armies in the entire game, but have largely been improved by the reversal of nerfs and a couple of small points cuts in the balance update. GW did seem to be at least fairly light touch with them, only a few points cuts to things like Rust August and Cerberus Raiders. Rangers generally got a bit stronger with their rapid fire stratagem being back, and perhaps above all anything else, Iron Striders getting core back means they now have a really powerful source of ranged firepower. The Skitarii units seem to have seen the lion's share of the buffs for some reason, despite arguably being the strongest bit already. I still feel that the veteran cohort is probably going to be the best way to play Adeptus Mechanicus, with its very nice warlord trait relic and stratagems. In general though, I wouldn't say they've seen the most improvements from the Nephilim book. Admech really don't like the command point changes, as they like to spend loads of command points pre-game, and also their secondaries weren't particularly helpful either. They're kind of perhaps a little bit hard to play with quite a lot of moving parts and buffs to put on units, and prior to these changes they were really quite weak indeed. I feel that perhaps the single biggest buff that they got was the Iron Striders getting core back, although I think it means that a lot of the army now feels redundant again behind Rostalkers, Iron Striders, Rangers and screening units. I think there's just not a lot of incentive to take much more than that. I guess that might be all they need to secure at least a few results at tournaments, but it's perhaps not the greatest news for army diversity maybe. Moving on though, and here we have Tier 1, things that I think are going to be strong threatening armies in 40k, and genuinely going to be taking top spots at tournaments when people do play strong lists for them and to their maximum capacity. As I said at the start of the video, I'm sure I'm going to get at least a little bit of flack for ranking so many armies Tier 1. My genuine prediction though is that I think quite a lot of armies are going to have the chance to compete now, and 40k is looking a lot more balanced than it was previously. Certainly nothing compared with the crazy power disparities that we had with Tyranids, Tau, Harlequins and Custodes lording it over everyone earlier in the year. All of those have been reined in, and a lot of the other things have been buffed up a bit to meet their level. For a bit more nuance, I have ranked a couple of them as maybe a little bit higher out of the pack, and a few of them maybe lower tier out of these. I guess in theory you could count these as different tiers if you wanted to, though I'd argue that the imbalances probably aren't quite big enough to warrant their own tier altogether. In any case, let's kick off with the lower tier 1 ones, where I've ranked Necrons, Adeptus Custodes, the Knights, and Space Marines. We'll start up with the Astartes, and just in general, Space Marines do have a fair bit going for them. Enormous unit choice and enormous sub-faction choice with which to apply those units, and of course Armour of Contempt making just about everything a little bit more durable than it used to be before. They've got a few recent points cuts. I'd say most of them were to fairly bad units already, but there's a few interesting ones like the ones to Guilliman or Eliminators, and particularly so for the Blood Angel Sanguinary Guard. They still have plenty of very solid generic datasheets, things like Eradicators, Redemptors, and multiple choices for different melee elites, and some very nice characters with which to buff them and lend a hand in combat. For the Nephilim changes, one thing that will weaken them a little bit is Oaths of Moment being nerfed quite a lot. Previously that was a very strong, almost auto-take secondary in some games. And while the standard Space Marines did get a fair few helpful points things out of the balance updates, as I said, I don't really think that they added all that much strength to the faction, as they might still be on units that you're not really all that tempted to take. I still think they're more than capable of punching up, particularly for some of their sub-factions, but I don't think we're going to be back to the point of Space Marines sweeping all the tournaments once again. Here's just a few thoughts on the specific chapters, as obviously Space Marine chapters vary massively in strength between the stronger ones and the weaker ones, even though they do have access to all the same datasheets. I'd say probably for strongest Space Marine chapter right now, I would probably rank the Blood Angels. It's weird how times have changed for them. They seem to have been probably the single best beneficiary of Armour of Contempt. Sanguinary Guard were already a pretty standout unit for them, and it helped them perhaps more than anyone else, being a 2+ save infantry unit without an invul. And then Games Workshop doubled down on that with a pretty decent points cut for them on top of that. They were already putting in some decent tournament work before. With that and cheaper Death Company, I wouldn't be at all surprised if we continue to see a fair few Blood Angels armies doing well, packing 3 meaty units of Golden Guys in power armor. Otherwise, perhaps for some of the stronger picks, I would also rank Iron Hands, who work great with vehicle synergies, and that's not too bad at a time when there's lots of vehicles buffed by the balanced data slate. For anything non-core vehicle related, they're perhaps one of the best choices, and have plenty of other helpful stratagems for infantry and their character dread that can hide. Dark Angels I think are still going to be a really solid choice. Terminator spam with objectives secured, now with cheaper Deathwing Knights and cheaper Ezekiel and Azrael, both of which were great already. I've talked about them here for brevity, though I'd argue that these should be perhaps more mid-tier 1 rather than lower tier. Otherwise, I think the Ultramarines are looking really interesting, particularly with Guilliman getting such a whopping points decrease down to 300 points. Their rapid redeployment thing is still really nice, though a bit more painful on the pre-game now, and they get on great with heavy Eradicators. Space Wolves have always had their massive melee power, have the armour of Ross, though I'd say they didn't get as much from the points drops compared with some. Deathwatch can either make their solid Dreadnought castles, or go for their Army of Renown with their cheaper specialisms, Again, I'm not convinced that they gained enormous amounts from this update, but perhaps those Spectres kill teamers with the last fusel eliminators are looking particularly nice. The Black Templars, I'd argue Armour of Contempt has maybe decreased their relevance a tiny bit. Previously, one of their best strengths was they got that 5+ invul save vow, which was really nice as a boost to survivability, and post Armour of Contempt it just isn't as meaningful an advantage. Giving up on light cover can actually be a really bad choice, and you need to get to excessive APs before you trigger the invul. It does free them up to take one of the melee vows though, and they certainly got some very nice improvements to their standard Crusader squad. I expect to be seeing plenty of bricks around them, backed up by their relic bearers and their great support characters like Helbrecht and Grimoldus. Quite nice that Grimoldus doesn't give up as many points for Assassinate anymore as well. White Scars will certainly remain a very potent melee chapter, advance and charge +1 damage, Corsaro Khan giving buffs, and I think they will appreciate the new cheaper Outriders at 45 points, though I'm not sure it's quite been enough to actually make them into a really strong unit. Finally, Salamanders that had rank on the lower middle tier, certainly good for their raw melter might, and it's interesting that they've had their side grade into turning off wound rerolls now. Against some armies that's really powerful, though less so against others. Finally, for the lower tier, as they basically have been all edition, Raven Guard and Imperial Fists I can't really see doing any better than they have been for the rest of the edition. Raven Guard's infiltration tricks for command points won't be helped out by the command point changes, though Deep Striking Unlikely Things and Kavan Shrike are both nice advantages. For the Imperial Fists, they do have their better bolters and the Eye of Hypnoth, but not all that much else. Moving on with the lower end of Tier 1, we've got the Adeptus Custodes, certainly running rampant in January and the early part of 2022, though they have seen an awful amount of nerfs since then. I still think they've got the capability of being a really solid army with lots of melee in the midboard. Custodian Guard are still very respectable. Their bikes and Dreadnought datasheets are still really nice, and their stats shield captains are incredibly dangerous with decent relic options. Combine all that with layer buffs from the Emperor's Chosen and the Martial Qatar, and I still think they're a very solid threat. Tough units on objectives and hard to shift, and they don't really care as much about the command point changes as some, being very happy to use single battalions. Still though, I'd certainly be ranking them towards the lower end of Tier 1. They have had several successive nerfs, stratagems being reined in, OBSEC lost on non-troops infantry, making the Terminators and Wardens kind of redundant, and in particular in this last balance change, Trajan Valoris got a really big points bump. He went all the way from 160 to 200. They've certainly got some good advantages, though being very elite and not that quick doesn't always help them out. They can tend to be at least a bit reactive, and even their signature durability might struggle against the various flavours of Armour of Contempt Terminator running around. Getting +1 to a 2-up save is very hard to overcome. My guess is that they'll still be putting in good performances at events every so often, but certainly nowhere near the force that they once were. Next up, we've got the Knights. Both the Chaos and the Imperial flavours do seem to have been doing decently well since the Codex dropped, perhaps medium to upper tier before the balance changes, and they didn't really get all that much different in the Nephilim update. Probably out of the two, if I'd had to rate one stronger than the other, I'd probably say the Imperial Knights are coming away with it a little better, but they'd both definitely have their own advantages. On the Chaos side, the dread abilities are pretty powerful against the armies that they're relevant. War Dogs have fast OBSEC and are really quite efficient datasheets just in their own right. House Herpatrax is pretty nice for a mixed list with big and small knights, with all the extra durability it brings, or perhaps Vextrix if you want max War Dogs, or Commentis if you really want to play around the Infernal rolls. In particular, a lot of people seem to like playing with a very tanky Abominant with the 5+ Feel No Pain and other durability buffs. A pretty nice anvil to hold down an objective, and its melee can be pretty rough as well with Iconoclast and its own psychic spell. And demonic favours scattered throughout the army can add quite a lot of power as well, particularly the undivided ones for extra durability and the chance to stand back up. On the downside, unfortunately, a fair few armies just don't really care all that much about dread abilities, things with very high leadership or lots of vehicles and stuff. Knights in general will often have very good or bad matchups, they tend to be hyper elite and don't have much screening, and if you run into an army that's absolutely packed with anti-tank fire, then they're going to go down pretty quickly. Fast OBSEC War Dogs can make them quite good on primary objectives, but can be a little bit lacking on secondaries without all that much choice, and both for them and the Imperials they'll often want to spend a lot of command points pre-game, not that good when you're only limited to 6 of them. For both these and the Loyalists as well, terrain can be pretty unhelpful. If there's a lot of it around, then it can protect the enemy and keep you from combats. Over on the Imperial side, there's quite a lot of similarities. I'd say maybe the Imperials might have it a little bit less bad on the command point front, as they do have the Chivalric Oath that gives you command points each turn, meaning that you can spend pretty heavily pre-game. and the oaths should give you some decent extra damage as well if you can avoid being dishonoured. Otherwise, for their main advantages, they maybe have a bit more synergy with their armigers. They get damage -1 on them with their bondsman abilities, and easy access to advance and charge with a knight errant is really quite cool for warglaives. For households, quite a lot of the choices do seem at least fairly tempting. Maybe Tyranids or Raven are some of my favourites. Tyranids for standing back up and feel no pain is pretty cool, though the Imperialist side seems usable as well. Griffith for the extra combat might and a good warlord trait, or that new noble competence one looks really interesting just for a flat increase in melee damage against hard targets. A lot of people seem to be running a Knight Paladin as a Princeps to give another Knight reroll ones to hit and wound, which is a big buff as well. And I would say that compared with the Chaos Knights, perhaps the Imperials do have slightly superior warlord traits and relics on the whole. There's a lot of really snazzy stuff that they can pick up. On the downside, it's mostly fairly similar things. Maybe compared with the Chaos, they're a bit more vulnerable to Alpha Strike. If the armigers go down before the -1 damage is applied, it can be a bit easier. And they perhaps might struggle against hordes a little bit more if you happen to run into them, as they don't have easy anti-horde options like the War Dog chain cannons. Overall though, I think both of them are still capable of being decently strong, but being an army of super heavy vehicles, it does mean that a bad matchup could really ruin them. Finally, for the lower end of Tier 1, we have the Necrons, who again were one of the armies that was really quite struggling before all the balance updates, but between a whole bunch of rules changes and points drops, they've got an enormous amount of improvements, and are genuinely looking like a lot more of a force to be reckoned with once again. For the points cuts, Mr. Silent King Zarek himself is looking really nice, down to 420 points, can buff himself with his own rerolls, and has the slightly disturbing prospect of resurrecting those Trial Menhir. The Catan also went down significantly, and they were being played before. The rest of the HQs dropped, which is pretty handy for the army in general, and Locust Heavy Destroyers being down even cheaper really is quite cool for those enormous power anti-tank shots. On top of that, a lot of units are core now, including all the vehicles. It means that My Will Be Done can go quite a long way on big threatening units. Command protocols just got crazily better, no positioning restrictions, and you get your favourite buff all game long, which is really big for armies like Novok with a dedicated melee one, for example. And that ought to being at least decently durable already with the warrior blocks and reanimations, not really needing to spend all that many CP pre-game for warlord traits or relics, and you've got the Necrons looking a lot more threatening than they were previously. My first thought is that Novok melee lists are going to be really interesting, that there might be some room for Mefrit shooting or the custom dynasties with the OBSEC and the pre-game move. Still though, at the moment I'm not expecting them to just be sweeping tournaments all over the place. A lot of units just don't really have all that great damage output, and many aren't particularly fast, and a lot of their rivals also got decent buffs as well. I think prior to the datasheet they were struggling really quite a lot. I think this is enough to get them to be decently good, though probably not overpowered. Still though, good times for the Necrons. It's really nice to see them get some actual meaningful buffs. They do feel like they've been playing catch up for most of the edition. Back to the big list then, and let's go through the middle of Tier 1 armies. Here I've chosen to rank some of the stronger armies out of the Space Marines: Tyranids Drukhari, Chaos Marines, Thousand Sons, Death Guard, Grey Knights, and Tau Empire. Starting out with what is perhaps I think the lower end of this spectrum, the Tyranids have certainly been cut down hard from their lofty perch. Previously they were pretty much undisputably the top army in Warhammer 40K over the last few months. Insanely powerful datasheets combined with very solid army special rules, and just about every second tournament was being won by a Tyranid army. Most other armies feeling like they were at a bit of a disadvantage compared with the Bogs. It really didn't feel like Games Workshop held back with their punches when they were addressing the Nids though. They got hit pretty hard with some really sizable points nerfs across the majority of their best units. Things like Maleceptors, Hive Tyrants, Harpies, Tyranid Warriors, and more, all going up in points. In addition, they made Hive Tyrants a bit annoying. They're a liability if they're killed, as they get rid of your synaptic imperatives, and the adaptive part of their Hive Fleet trait is now far less adaptive, as you can't pick it in response to your opponent, which you previously could. Certainly a whole bunch of mighty blows. I think it is a bit difficult to gauge just how far they'll fall from this though, as they are a codex with a ton of other fairly decent options as well, and I feel that a fair few of those might come into force now the absolute most obviously crazy strong things have been reined in. The nerfs did hit very hard, but maybe some of the most obvious things that could still do well are Harpies with Stranglethorn cannons, which I still think seem kind of undercosted. Hive Tyrants in general are still really quite good powerhouses. If they're taken out towards the end of the game, it's still maybe not the worst deal. Rupture Cannon Tyrannofexes deal an enormous amount of damage to heavies from a long range. The Parasite and Mortrex with the Warlord trait can be great for flipping over objectives and harassing enemy infantry. Their troops have solid fast obsec, and they've still got that strong psychic phase with neurothropes and zoanthropes, and giving the entire army a invul save for a turn. All in all, I think the Tyranids have been hit hard by this, but I still think they're going to be taking at least some top spots in tournaments. I think I would have rated them either lower mid-tier 1 or somewhere in lower tier 1. They certainly don't feel like one of the strongest armies in the game anymore. Next up we have the Drukhari, who I'd also rank in the lower end of this section. They were certainly terrifyingly powerful for most of early 9th edition, though I think in their current form they're really quite a well internally balanced codex. Almost all of their units are usable, though maybe aren't quite as crazily strong as they used to be. They've got lots of really quite cheap units that can easily kill something that's far more valuable than themselves. Things like incubi and fighty characters, and racks make for great cheap objective units with a little bit of melee threat for bullying others like them. They might do kind of well out of Nephilim with their multi-patrol setup. They have more access to detachment slots than most of the other armies in the game with that, and being very fast with cheap troops is a pretty decent thing for objective scoring. They did also get their small buff to witches as well in the Nephilim points drops. Overall, I describe Drukhari as a pretty solid, well-balanced codex right now. Mostly relatively fragile units that can punch up and move very fast. They definitely have a lot more competition from the other codexes these days. Next up, we're into the Chaos factions, and I've chosen to rank the new kids on the block here, Codex Chaos Space Marines, though I do admit at this point we haven't had much chance to see them in action and see how they work against the other armies. At the moment, my first impression is that it's looking solid but not overpowered. A few interesting and really powerful tricks. I feel like some of the most powerful things seem to come from the Master of Possession, buffing possessed Warp Talons or Obliterators, or maybe the usual cast of Chaos characters amping up big Terminator blobs with multiple buffs. It seems that Games Workshop have done at least somewhat well in balancing the different legions. Certainly the Word Bearers, Iron Warriors, and Emperor's Children look like they all add some really powerful advantages, and maybe even creations of Bile or Red Corsairs might get played as well for powerful legion traits. Abaddon himself is also looking like a massive melee powerhouse as well. It seems that he could be a pretty reasonable pickup in many armies, particularly if you're playing Black Legion. In terms of weaknesses, maybe ranged anti-tank does seem to be a bit lacking just with the previous decks, and perhaps one of the main challenges might be delivering ground-based melee units into combat without getting them shot down in the meantime. Though I guess if you're going with Possessed or Warp Talons, at least they're quite fast. Going to be interesting to see what sort of builds come out of the new codex. I'll certainly be covering them on the channel once we've had some tournament results. Next up, I've also gone with ranking the other two legions on the same level. First up we have the Thousand Sons. The Thousand Sons were kind of doing okay before all the changes, perhaps upper middle tier, and then got at least a fair few handy buffs from Nephilim, particularly the Rubric Marines getting some free gear was nice, and cheaper Soul Reaper cannons. A few of the armor data sheets and Magnus going down in points are also quite fun. With a lot of their rivals for the top spots being reined in a bit, I think they're in for a new lease of life. Plenty going for them, including big sets of psychic buffs on efficient squads, teleporting and temporal surge to get the durable obsec units to the right places, and they can always turn on the big mortal wound damage hoover if they need to with their psychic phase. As with things like Grey Knights, they are quite weak to anything that has some very serious mortal wound protection or good psychic denial. They perhaps can be quite slow when they don't have their movement tricks, and maybe their damage is kind of underwhelming without the layered buffs of the sorcerers going into them. Perhaps a fair few units also seem kind of redundant, like the Zangors, though I think most Thousand Sons players would generally prefer that the Rubrics and the Terminators tend to take centre stage, as opposed to the supporting cast. Next up we've got the Death Guard, another army that I would have been ranking really quite weak indeed before the updates, but Games Workshop has been rather generous with the points drops for these guys, reverting a whole bunch of stuff back to prior to when they got their nerfs. A few things are cheaper than they've ever been before, and I'd bear in mind that prior to their nerfs they didn't have Armour of Contempt as well, so certainly things like their Terminators and Plague Marines are going to be tougher to shift than they ever have been. I feel like Death Guard armies are going to be a lot more fun to play with against. Poxwalkers seem great again at 5 points with their cheap obsec and nice mortal wounds when you want to turn it on with a stratagem. The Terminators all have obsec and Armour of Contempt now, and are really durable and nice at their improved points cost. And perhaps more than anything else, Plague Marines just look like they could be hilariously threatening with all those plague weapons that you can pile onto them. They might not be quite as durable as the Terminators with their 2+ saves, but they can pack a pretty ridiculous punch in melee if the enemy does get close. Otherwise, they're generally happy in a single battalion, so are going to be alright with the CP changes as it goes, and they do have their nice Spread the Sickness secondary, which will also help them out. Finally, the Vehicles and Mortarion also dropped in points. Plague Burst Crawlers being as cheap as they are does seem a little bit on the ridiculous side now. Despite all this, they are generally quite slow, a lot of units don't have the biggest damage output, and they don't like mortal wounds all that much. I'm not convinced they're going to be one of the top factions in the game just like that, but they certainly are looking pretty threatening after all these changes. Next up, we've got the Grey Knights, again a faction that didn't change all that much. Plenty of decent things going for them as before. Solid all-rounders and Dread Knights between their focus shooting, then psychic and melee. Strike squads and interceptors are decent troops for objectives, plus pack a punch whenever the enemy gets too close. Paladin blocks can be really nice with armored resilience, giving +1 to your saves on top of Tide of Shadows makes them near impossible to shift, and a lot of their squads can jump around the board with their teleport tactics. They also have their Purifying Ritual secondary, which is kind of good. They're perhaps still a little bit toned down compared with their initial drop. You can't spam Brotherhoods or Grandmaster Dread Knights anymore, and if enemies do have heavy Deny the Witch or Mortal Wound protection, they're going to be in trouble. Overall though, I certainly feel they look like a solid army, not one to be underestimated with the damage that they can put out between Psychic, their shooting and melee. Finally, for the mid-tier 1 armies, we have the Tau. Again, a faction that lost out a whole load in the balance update. A whole ton of points cost went up, particularly the crisis suits that were hit very hard indeed, but also things like commanders, broadsides, ethereals, drones, and the storm surge. A lot of their competitive units went up a bit. Despite all that, though, I think the Tau are still going to be in a position to win games. I think the crisis suits are still usable, maybe 1 or 2 units now, as opposed to just spamming an entire army of them. They've still got good weapons, and the commander buffs really take them to the next level, and you can have a squad jump shoot jumping in and out of cover to stay safe. I feel that perhaps Hammerheads and Skyrays might be the go-to choice to support them now, more so than Storm Surges or Broadsides, and I feel that quite a lot of people might be using more Breaches and Devilfish. Not a bad option to slingshot some OBSEC onto an objective, and the Pulse Blasters really can tear some decent holes in things. Tausept still has some decent advantages, including the +1 to wound. Montcar still a nice damage boost, and even at the higher points cost, I think that the Ethereals are pretty solid. 5+ feel no pain, and farming command points really is good value for an 100-point character. Again, like the Tyranids, they're a case of a top army that's seen a fair few nerfs, and it's going to be interesting to see how well the lists adapt. Maybe I've been a little bit generous ranking them up here, but they're still an army with some devastating shooting and a ton of mobility. Finally, we get into a trio of armies that I think might be a cut above the rest, and still taking a fair few more tournament placings than you might expect. First up, we have the Craftworlds. Before the points and rules changes, I would have ranked them as one of the top factions, maybe second or third, and certainly compared with the Tyranids, they don't feel like they've been hit anywhere near as hard with their nerfs. A lot of things did go up in points, but a lot of them only by small amounts like 1 or 2, often equating to nerfs that were less than 10% or so. They were also hit with Fire and Fade, and Hail of Doom is a little bit worse than it was before, not being able to combo with anything else, but it still remains intact and very strong. Their Psychic seems pretty well just as good as it ever was. Farseers didn't really get touched all that hard by the points nerfs. Guide, Doom, Fortune, Jinx and more make the rest of the army very efficient indeed. I still feel it's likely for the most competitive list to be weighing up between Ulthwé with plenty of Farseers, or Hail of Doom for a shuriken spamming army, with the 6s to hit translating to 6s to wound. And I don't think it's the end of the world if that doesn't combine with Ignores Cover or Stealthy anymore. They're very fast getting their units where they need to be, and there's still also a ton of very strong datasheets that weren't even touched. Despite going up 20 points, I still think Bararoth is an excellent utility piece. Shining Spears were good before and remain good now, Wind Riders with Shuriken Catapults, and Viper Jetbikes. Plus there's always the option of allying in some Harlequins if you did want some alternative aspect warriors. Overall, I still think that the Craftworlds are likely to be pretty strong indeed. Perhaps particularly still Mass Shurikens being able to hoover many armies straight off the board, combined with their psychic buffs and speed. Next we have the Adepta Sororitas, an army that I would have ranked fairly mid-tier before the changes, but then got Armour of Contempt and extra miracle dice, making them look a lot better. And now Games Workshop has doubled down with them, with really quite big meaningful points cuts to things like Zephyrim, Seraphim and Sacrosanct. They already had quite a lot of good damage dealing reliable options such as Retributors and Repentia, but I feel that adding to these Bloody Rose, Zephyrim are going to be a really popular pick now, for 15 points for their mass power weapon attacks, plus very easy buffs from stratagems. They're going to be a really cool one to run. Seraphim were also really quite decent for dropping down with hand flamers and doing objective type things. Now they'll do that even cheaper. And it's quite nice to have Sacrosancts actually competing well with the other options once more as a more durable choice. Their points cost will certainly help them. Combine all those units with decent buffing characters such as the Dog Martyr or Morvenn Val herself, Having miracle dice for some really reliable charges or big damage, and some nice reliable new secondaries, and I think the sisters are in a good place for a recipe for a success. Still though, I don't think that they stand massively above the other tier 1 factions. Their models are still really quite expensive points wise, high AP damage one shooting or mass mortal wounds will get through them quite quickly, and having strength and toughness 3, a lot of their units can get bullied in melee a bit more easily than some of the other factions. Still though, looking very solid. I suspect people will be seeing a fair bit more success with them. Maybe we'll see some more Paragon warsuits and things stomping around tournament tables. Finally, last but not least, we have the Harlequins. Again, like the Custodes, they've been through a fair few nerfs since their codex dropped, points cost increasing, a few emergency nerfs, and then got a whole load more things from the balanced data slate, fewer lock dice, worse access to fire and fade, and both the light and dark Sadaths being toned down. However, despite that, I think their datasheets remain very strong indeed. Troops and Starweavers have got a bit weaker due to light and dark not being as good, but still overall they're a really powerful core to the army and have a lot of sneaky tricks. Having crazy mobility is always great for objective games, and I'd still say that every single one of their limited unit pool is very usable indeed. Despite the nerfs, I still think they're going to be a tricky threat to face, maybe requiring a little bit more skill to play now, and perhaps we'll see people using things like Twilight for the massively amped up melee. I feel like they might be subsiding a bit more back into their niche of being an army that's a little bit more tricky to play though. Now with both light and dark being nerfed, they've both made their respective Sadaths a little bit easier to take out either at range or in melee. So anyway, I think we'll leave that there for our slightly speculative post-Nephilim tier list. Let me know what you think down in the comments below, particularly if you think I've ranked anything too high or too low, and perhaps more than anything else, which armies you think are going to be top after all these changes. I'll certainly be looking to revisit the video once we have a bit more data. On the whole though, I'm pretty positive about the changes. At least from first impressions, 40k is looking like it's a lot more balanced than it's been throughout just about all of 9th edition. If you've enjoyed the video, feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics, where I'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming, with new ones out just about every day. Finally, if you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page, and that's what allows me to make quite so many videos like this quite so regularly. If you are enjoying a lot, any support is enormously appreciated. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things happen next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.